to start by removing the wheel, 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts. Remove your wheel. With a 14mm, I'm going to loosen up these 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. Okay, leave that one in for now. Break this one free. Now you can remove them both fully. Okay, set them aside. Now you remove the caliper off of the bracket and off of the pads. And I like to set it aside right on top of the knuckle here. That way it doesn't fall, and you basically don't want to put any pressure on this brake hose. So right here it's secure. Now we can remove our pads. With a little pry bar, I'm going to remove the pads. These ones are kind of stuck in here. With a 17mm, take off these 2 bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle. Okay, I'm going to leave this one in, just a few threads to hold the bracket as I remove the top one. Okay, with this top one off, let's go ahead and remove the bottom one as well, and remove the bracket. Now let's remove the rotor. Mine is stuck on here, so I'm going to put a lug nut on. That way it doesn't fly off when it finally does break free. Now I'm going to take my hammer and just hammer on it anywhere on the surface, preferably from the back side to push it off the hub. That's the best way to go. Okay, it's starting to move, so I'm going to spin it. Hammer it on the opposite side. There we go. Remove the safety lug nut, which did its job. And now you can remove the rotor. At this point, I want to clean up the hub surface and make it nice and, well, shiny, but basically what you want to do is just get rid of these raised areas, all the rust flakes that are in here, because you want the new rotor to sit nice and flush with the hub. So I'm going to use a little sanding disc, but you can use a wire brush. Obviously, if yours is more severely pitted and rotted than this, a sanding disc will be the best way to go, but a wire brush would also do the trick, as long as the end result is that the hub is nice and flat and clean. Now I could make it a little more shinier than this, but I did remove all the raised areas that I could with that sanding disc. So next I'm going to go in with my wire brush in between the studs and make sure that there's nothing in there. All right, let's hit it with some brake parts cleaner just to remove all the oils, debris, and whatever's left over. And then once this dries off, we'll put a nice coating of anti-seize on it. That way this does not happen again. I'm going to put some anti-seize on the hub. Try to avoid the studs as much as possible. If you have the brushed kind, that's best. But either way, you want to cover this. That way it's protected from the elements. I'm going to put the new rotor on backwards, and that's just going to make it easier for me to clean the surface. It comes coated from the factory with oil. That way it doesn't rust when it's sitting up on the shelf. So clean it off with some brake parts cleaner, flip it over, install it the right way, and we'll clean the outer surface as well. Same way, brake parts cleaner, little rag, just wipe it off. It's important to do this, otherwise you get oil on your brake pads, and well, that's not good. So now that this is installed, I'm going to put a lug nut on here just to hold it in place for me. Okay, now we can move on to cleaning and re-lubricating the caliper bracket, so we can install that next. With the caliper bracket on my workbench, I'm going to remove the anti-rattle clips. Make sure that I clean underneath. This one's pretty rusty, so I actually have, you can use a wire brush, but in most cases if it's super rusty like this one, it's not going to get everything off. So what I'm going to use is this little grinder wheel, which you have to be very careful when you do use this. Typically you just want to use a sanding disc, but this is what I have that fits best in here. And I'm just going to go slow and kind of grind off the surface here, the surface rust. I want to get all the raised areas and the chunks off. That way the new anti-rattle clips can sit flush. If you don't clean this properly, then your pads are going to get squished in between the two ends and you'll have braking issues. Now that this is clean, I'm going to apply a thin layer of grease. That's going to prevent rust from building up in the future, and you don't want too much because otherwise it'll squeeze out in the middle and get on the rotor. Now you want to grab your new anti-rattle clips and just position them so that they can fall back into place and press in all the way. This is how they go with the taller part towards the back and this little hook spring that hooks onto this part here. There we go. All right, and now you want to do the same to the other side. Now that those are done, let's clean up the slider pins next. So remove them from the boot. These still have some grease in them, so I don't have to worry about rust or anything like that. If you did have rusty slider pins, you'd want to take a bore brush and clean inside here to make sure that there's no more rust there. But like I said, in my case, they're good, so I'm just going to wipe off the old grease and put on some new one. I like to add a little bit of extra grease inside of the boot. That's going to act as a reserve of grease. If you really pack it onto the slider, a lot of it will get washed off by the boot itself. So just add some, and if you need extra grease, put it inside the boot. As you add grease to the slider, you want to make sure that you add some on that ridge there. That's where the boot seals up, and without grease, it's less likely to have a watertight seal. Grease will help it seal up nicely. Okay, now that it's greased up, slide it in, and you'll notice sometimes there's air stuck, so it wants to push back out. What you can do in that case is press on the slider, squeeze the boot, and that's going to squeeze out the air that's in there. That sits perfectly. So let's do the same to this side. Now you'll notice that this side has the rubber boot on the slider, so you want to make sure that it goes back in the hole that it came out of. So again, wipe off the old grease, and I do have a little bit of rust starting on this lip there, so I will take it over to my wire wheel and clean off that rust. You can just use a wire brush if you don't have a wire wheel, but basically you want that nice and clean so the boot can seal up. I'm going to do the same thing to this side, add just a little bit of extra grease in there, work it in to the accordion part of the boot, and then grease up the pin itself. And bring the grease all the way up to this little ridge here. Slide it in. Okay, there we go. This side slides in. Let's get the bracket back onto the knuckle. Let's start in these two bolts. If you want to, you can use thread locker on these, but definitely do not put any grease or anti-seize on these threads. Let's torque these to 79 foot-pounds. The outer pad does not get a wear indicator, only the inner pad does. Make sure that the pads slide in, and if they're not sliding freely in and out, that means you didn't clean up the ends of the bracket here, and the pads is getting squished, so when you apply the brakes, they won't release and you'll have braking issues. To compress the caliper piston to go back in, I'm going to use an old brake pad, put it here, then I'm going to use my caliper depression tool. If you don't have a tool like this, you can just use a large pair of pliers or basically anything that will slowly and gently squeeze this piston back in. And I'm just going to go slow. You don't want to go fast with this. But as long as it goes back smoothly, you're good. If it takes a lot of force to push it back, that means your caliper piston's seized and you need a new caliper. Mine's going back very smoothly, so I'm just going to go until it bottoms out completely. One more pump here, and it should be right about there. And doing this will allow us to get the caliper over the new pads that are thicker. That's bottomed out right there. Release the tool, remove your old pad, and let's get the caliper back on. And before I fully install the caliper, I'm going to add just a little bit of grease to these two ears here. That's going to help the pads operate quietly and smoothly. You don't need a lot. You don't want it to get all over the place. And I'm also going to add some to this outer ring of the piston for the same exact reason. Again, you don't need a lot. Now take your caliper, flip it over, make sure it's not twisted. Slide it over the pads, make sure it lines up with the bracket with the sliders. These sliders have a slight cutout on them, and they basically need to line up with this right here. Start in the two bolts to secure the caliper on. Let's bottom these out and then torque them to 25 foot-pounds. That's one. And two. Perfect. Now you want to do the same thing to the other side of the vehicle, then pump up your brakes, and then let's get the wheel on. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, then I'll torque them to 76 foot-pounds.